YouTube is thinking about it. There, there. All right. It is up and running. Yes. Let's go back to other screen and take a look. I think we're just about ready. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get things rolling, as they say. So we are looking at Parashat Beshallach, and in Parashat Beshallach, of course, the most famous thing is the actual parting of the sea. Shirat Hayam, the song of the sea, is incredibly moving, so much so that a portion of it has become part of, well, a very famous part of our liturgy. Actually, quotes from it have been sprinkled around, but Mi Chamocha, of course, is something that almost everybody learns as part of the daily service. However, we've talked about the splitting of the sea before, so we have to talk about something a little bit different. And instead, we're going to talk about the issue of Mar'ah. Mar'ah is another place, and it is a place of the bitter waters. And as such, there's a very interesting exchange. But before we dive into the text, let me just fill in the story narratively. Here we are in chapter 15. We have just, I mean, literally just finished the celebration at the seaside. Yam Suf has just finished. Yam Suf is the Sea of Reeds, a formal name of the body of water that we cross through. And we have celebrated, we have sung. It has been almost like a festival atmosphere, because at that moment, with Pharaoh and his forces defeated, our liberation looks set and secure, and the people are singing monumental praises to God in celebration. You have to have that in mind to understand the jarring juxtaposition that we see here in the story of Mar'ah, starting with verse 22. So keep that in mind. We are riding high. Just 3 days ago, we celebrated crossing the sea, and now this is what occurs. Moshe had Israel march on from the Sea of Reeds, and they went out to the wilderness of Shur. They traveled through the wilderness for 3 days and found no water. Now, that's not exactly surprising. I mean, after all, the Midbar, the wilderness, is noted for being the uninhabitable space, and one of the requirements for habitation, of course, is fresh water. They came to Marah, so this is after that 3-day journey, but they could not drink water from Marah because it was bitter, as it was Mar. Therefore, they called its name Marah. Just as a little aside, this is one of the interesting little signposts along the way, that the Torah will often introduce something by a name that it will come to be known by, even in that very story. And that can create a little bit of cognitive dissonance, a little confusion in the brain, because how could they have gotten there? Well, obviously, when they headed out, they didn't call it Marah. That wasn't the destination name in mind. They were just going that way. But they named it that after this experience, because the water itself was Marah. And yes, that is one of those things where the word Mar might be familiar to you from the word Maror, or from the entire story of the Egyptian slavery, where our life was made very bitter. So it is a very appropriate name. And of course, it is meant to evoke that memory of slavery, that we went from the bitterness of slavery to now the bitterness of water that cannot be drunk. And you can only imagine the feelings of frustration that here they are in the middle of the wilderness. They are liberated. They have not had water for 3 days, but now they finally found fresh water. Oh, it's not fresh water. It's bitter water. It is not fit for human consumption. That is almost more painful than finding no water at all. So hence the title. Bitterness is a great term. And the people grumbled against Moshe, saying, "What are we to drink?" Right? So they are asking the logical question, what are we supposed to drink? The the complaints against Moses get much louder and much stronger later in the story of the Exodus. But here we see one of the first complaints. Obviously, we had the earlier complaint of at the sea, at the edge of the sea before we crossed, complaining about being brought out to the desert in order to be slaughtered there. So here we see the continuation of the complaints a mere 3 days after that miracle, a mere 3 days after a miracle, which should have convinced the people that God wasn't going to do everything that he had done from the plagues and from the Exodus just to have them die of thirst. But the people are grumbling. They are complaining because, well, they are human beings. He cried out to Adonai, that is indicative of Moshe, of Moses, and Adonai directed him to some wood. He threw it in the water, and the water became sweet. There he imposed law and judgment for them, and there he tested them. All right, we're going to get to that second half in much more detail. But let's take a look at the first, which is the actual solution. So they've come to this water. The water is bitter, and the people are complaining to Moses. So Moses cries out. Now, we've seen this crying out a number of different times. We saw the crying out of the Israelites against the Egyptian bondage, which was one of the statements of the setting of God's intervention. We have seen the Egyptians cry out when they lost their firstborn. And now we are seeing Moses cry out on behalf of the people to try and solve this problem. And indeed, a solution comes. A piece of wood is thrown into the water becomes sweet, no problem. However, the second half of this verse gives us a very interesting context, that this was not just how did they drink in the wilderness? Oh, they threw wood and water, it was okay. But that something larger is happening here, that there is a meta-narrative beyond just their travels and search for water, that somehow this is law and judgment, chok umishpat, and somehow there is a test going on here. Now, we might try to work that out on our own, but thankfully, the Torah gives us a little bit more information in our next verse. He said, and it is some debate or whether this is Moses directly speaking on his own or whether this is Moses speaking on behalf of God, transmitting the words. If you will hearken, yes, hearken to the voice of Adonai your God. Let's just pause real quick because I like to give little tidbits of Hebrew grammar as we go through for those that would like to read it more in the original. You'll notice the phrase shamoa tishma, and this is a grammatical structure that does not occur in English. It is a infinitive intensifier. The same root, shin mem ayin, is used in both of those two words, shamoa tishma. I know that's hard to hear, but if you look at the letters, you can see them more easily because as English speakers, you might not be tuned in to how Hebrew uses its consonants. And the first word is an infinitive form. And the second word is the actual imperative verb. So in English, we would just say, listen up, right? Or if you will listen. And in Hebrew, that happens too, right? If you will listen is a perfectly fine sentence, im tishma. But im shamoa tishma is intensifying the listening. It is sharpening it in a way that doesn't really fit a grammatical structure in English. Now, what Everett Fox did was to try and use this doubling of the infinitive or the infinitive plus verb as a way to double it up in the English, which kind of works. If you will hearken, yes, hearken. Or I believe the JPS translation usually does the surely, if you will surely hearken, as indicative of this. But it is definitely something that is adding to the power of the statement, and it would be easy to get lost. So if you will hearken, yes, hearken to the voice of Adonai your God, and what is right in his eyes will do, and will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his laws. All the sickness which I have imposed upon Egypt, I will not oppose upon you, for I am Adonai your healer. Okay, that is a fairly major statement to be brought out for talking about water. What diseases are we talking about here? The sicknesses of Egypt. Well, was anybody sick? Well, again, the phrase machala does not always mean the standard type of illness that we think of where we would go to a doctor. This phrase can also mean other types of suffering or tragedy. For example, thirst, for the water to be ruined. And as we will see in our commentary, we do have a recent example of water being ruined. Indeed, going back to the beginning of the plagues all the way through to this point, we can see that we have an opening of the water of the Nile. We have the middle section, which focuses on the water of Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. And then we have this section where we have the water, the bitter water. So there is this three-part narrative of how the water figures in each of these stories. And here, there is a reminder that, yes, God is going to be helping, but if you hearken, then it will happen this way. And that is an important introduction. Yes, we had heard before that God was going to take us out, that he would be our God, we would be his people. But we'd also heard that God was doing this because of the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So is there more to it than that? Well, yes, says verse 26, there is a certain level of contingency. There's a certain level of our participation that we cannot just say, oh, God will do it for us. We have to be doing something, meeting God partway, halfway, take the pick of how you want to describe the proportional distribution of responsibility here. But apparently there will be expectations of us. And those expectations are not that we will sing songs and we will chant praises as we just did a few verses ago, but that we will obey God's commandments, that we will involve ourselves in God's Torah, in the mitzvot. So this seems a little out of left field, and the structure is a little awkward, which is, of course, why the commentaries have to weigh in. So before we take a look at our commentaries on this whole question, are there any other questions about the passages that we've read so far? Okay, then let's dive in. So let's start off with Ibn Ezra. He's a wonderful person to start with, and he is focusing on diligently hearken. This translation's attempt to capture that infinitive construct. I have already noted that when the word Shema, hearken, is followed by a lamet or bet, that is to say, as the prepositional prefix here, it does not mean to hear the words being spoken, but rather to understand the subject which is being verbalized. Shema in our verse thus means to understand what the Lord commands us to do. So we have this problem in English too, although it's not as noticeable, which is that the word Shema just means to listen. But just like in English, where the word listen can mean to hear words bouncing against your eardrums, and it can also mean to obey the words that are bouncing against your eardrums, hence the term hearken, which is probably the best English translation of the Hebrew Shema. We have to look for contextual clues of, are we just being told something so that it will hit our ears, or are we being told something so that we will understand the importance, the content, the meaning of what's coming? Ibn Ezra is giving us a little bit of a clue that if you look at the prepositions, when we say for somebody to shema, to listen, li or bi, to or with or in, then we are asking them to really plumb the meaning of something, not just to be quiet while I say my speech. And that seems to be the structure that we're dealing with here. So clearly there is something more to this than just a little phrase. He goes on to say, for you saw with your own eyes the diseases, the strokes, and the plagues which I put upon the Egyptians because they rebelled against me. And you'll notice again that he's got this whole idea of machala is extending to a much wider range of issues. And of course, the rebellion of the Egyptians against God is their refusal to allow the Israelites to go free when it was demanded. Now, if you will hearken to my statutes, meaning unlike the Egyptians, you will be saved from these plagues, for I will not do to you what I did to them. It seems very straightforward. Follow my halacha, follow my rules, and you will not have the same problems that the Egyptians did. Additionally, you have no need of a physician, for I am the Lord that heals you from all diseases which I have decreed to be upon the earth. I will heal you as I healed the bitter waters. Now we see the connection, which no physician has the ability to heal. Behold, what happened at Marah was the opposite of what occurred when the first plague struck. For the waters of the Nile were sweet, but the Egyptians could not drink from them. However, here the bitter waters turned sweet. You should therefore love the Lord and keep yourself from rebelling against him, for he will do good for you. So, even Ezra sees this as a very clear parallel from that first plague of the water of the Nile turning to blood, that there God showed that he could make the drinkable water undrinkable, and here he is showing that he can make undrinkable water drinkable. And that, therefore, should be taken to heart. We should be hearing this. We should be listening to it and letting it guide our actions, that if we actually follow what God has given us, then we will be able to enjoy similar types of benefit. Now, you'll notice that he adds the phrase in the middle here, you have no need of a physician, for I am the Lord that heals you, based off that final phrase in our passage. Well, does that mean then that Jews don't go to doctors? Far from it. Judaism is very clear that while in a idealized world where we believe that we would be in perfect harmony with God, such things would not be necessary. We know that for the entirety of our existence, we have always needed physical intervention. As such, not only does the Torah allow us to go to doctors for healing, but the Torah even commands it. If you injure another person, you have to pay for their healing. That means to say you pay their doctor bills in order that they can be made better by that doctor. So what we are talking about here is sort of the idealized world where our relationship with the God is so powerful and intimate that there is no need of additional material intervention. However, we are not at that stage in our existence. As such, doctors are still very much required and still very much our obligation, both to go to for ourselves as well as to assist others in receiving that material help too. So hopefully that makes that clear. But the concept here of what's happening in our passage is something that we still need to wrestle with, even if we may not be in the perfect idealized world where this is a one-to-one relationship. We still want to understand what that means. And according to Ibn Ezra, what is being argued here is that God is laying out a plan, that there is indeed a way to live, a right way to live, a good way to live. Indeed, you might even call it of following God's will and doing what is right in God's eyes, that will avoid the various calamities that can come along with physical life. And that is something that's going to demand more explanation. So let's take a look at what some of the other commentators say. I will not afflict you with, so that second half of our main verse. God implied that the reason he would not do so is that he would otherwise have to trouble himself to cure the Israelites from these diseases. Where's that implied? For I, the Lord, am your physician, meaning I would have to act as your physician after you had decided to listen to my voice, having been afflicted with such diseases as I struck the Egyptians with. God hints that no physician but he could have turned water into blood and reversed the process. So again, we see this idea of the water of the Nile and the water of Marah being seen as parallels to one another and showing that God does have the potential to exceed even our most gifted medical professionals. But notice that Chizkuni puts an extra little twist on the idea of God acting as our healer, that God does not want to afflict us. God doesn't hopes that won't be the case. That's why he wants us to do what is right, partly because, it's good for us, but also because as he puts it in his beautiful phrasing, God does not wish to trouble himself to cure. Now, that may sound a little odd, that God is being troubled, but the idea is not that God would be bothered by this, meaning that it's too much work or effort for God, or that God, was inconvenienced by it, because that doesn't really work as a description of God. Instead, it means that since God knows that we will eventually return, and eventually we will be healed from these things through the merit of our return, then God would just rather cut out the whole illness thing in the middle. There's no reason for it. If we're going to end up in the right place anyway, then why would we make the mistake in the first place? Now, implied within this is also the idea that these diseases may or may not be a direct affliction. For example, if somebody is living in a valley, they have their little house down there, and at the top of the valley there is a dam. And at the dam, there is somebody who works to keep back the floodwaters of the dam. That is to say, they are holding back the gate. And if they go on vacation, then the gates open, the water floods in, and the valley is flooded. Well, that person is holding back a danger, a threat, a problem. But they are not causing the threat or the problem. That is to say, they are intervening between the danger and the victim, but they are not creating the danger. On the other hand, and Chizkuni has not weighed in on this in this particular passage, what if we were to say there was a person at the top who was, yes, keeping the gate closed, but they also were the ones who had created the danger behind the wall. That is to say, when they open the gate, it is with an understanding that they will now hurt the person with that flood, not as a accident of them removing protection, but as a deliberate attack. So we have two different ways that can go, and we'll have to talk about that as we look through our other commentaries. So we turn to Ramban, also known as Nachmanides. Rabbi Ibn Ezra explained, and I didn't borrow his explanation because I knew I would be bringing this version, that shamoa tishma, that are will certainly hear, will diligently listen to, hearken to, means to understand, like we talked about. Understand the meaning of that which he has commanded you to do. And you will do that which is right in his eyes. This implies the positive commandments, remembering that in theological terms, a positive commandment is something you are commanded to do, and he will give ear to his commandments. This implies the negative commandments, meaning things that you have been commanded not to do. So a negative commandment is don't murder, don't steal, whereas a positive commandment would be to remember Shabbat, or to circumcise on the eighth day. It is something that we are commanded to do. That's positive, and something we are commanded not to do, that's negative. So Ibn Ezra takes this version of our text where it says, and what is right in his eyes will do, and will give ear to his commandments, and says, why is there repetition? Because the first section is about the positive, the second section is about the negative. With that in mind, Rabban then brings in another piece of text from the Mechilta, one of the great early Midrash collections, wherein the rabbis have said, and you will do that which is right in his eyes. This means in business dealings, meaning that phrase is not generically about a certain type of commandment. It is about the specific laws with regards to doing business. Now, that teaches us that if a person is honest in his business dealings and the spirit of his fellow creatures find pleasure in him because he is a good and honest person, it is accounted to him as though he had fulfilled the entire Torah. Now, what problem is Ramban trying to solve here? Well, if we were to look back at our verse 26 and read this in light of Chizkuni in particular, and say, well, we have to hearken to God's words. We have to do what is right. We have to give here. We have to keep, oh dear, kol chukav, all of his laws. Then we can avoid the sicknesses. Well, if I have to keep all of the laws, that's going to be hard because that means there's like no room for mistake. And what's the time scale? I can't keep all the laws of the calendar in one day. I have to keep them over the course of an entire year at minimum, and then next year and next year. And how can I be expected to keep all of Torah? That seems to be quite a challenging ask. And if we've added in this notion that if we don't keep all of Torah, that we have sicknesses waiting in our wing, then I'm going to be sick. Ramban tells us, no, according to Mechilta, there's a more narrow way to construe this, that if you are doing what is right, meaning what is honest in your business dealings, then that means you are currently in good shape. You are doing what is enough to be considered as having done the entire Torah. It doesn't mean you get to break other commandments and go murder someone just because you were honest in your business, but it is trying to relieve some of that tension that sometimes we can feel of never feeling like we've done enough by saying, no, there is a way to do enough that you need not fear, and that just means be basically honest in your business according to the rules of Torah. If you do that, and if people are happy to see you because of it, then you're in a good place. That you are holding the minimum line in a way that will keep you safe. Okay, we'll give a little pause there, see if there are any questions. Switch back over to the YouTube channel, take a look. No one's putting comments there. Okay, so Ramban then wants to continue and introduce a more difficult question to ourselves. It is not customary that a master should assure his servants that if you will do all my will and desire, I will not slay you with sore diseases. That sounds really kind of backwards when you think about that. None of the divine assurances of the Torah are expressed in that way. That when we look at other mitzvot and other places where God gives us assurances and gives us strength, it's not mentioned in companion with this idea of diseases. So how do we understand this section? Well, rather the verse here constitutes an admonition, a warning, by which he warned them not to be among those that rebel against him, as the Egyptians have been. So this is not about if you will do all of my laws, then I will not. Instead, we are going to cross out the negative and flip over the positive and turn it into, if you don't do, then you will be. Meaning that if you violate Torah, then you will become vulnerable to the same types of problems that happened in Egypt. Now, it may feel like that's the same thing because, if you were doing your algebra equation, it would be equal to swap the positive and negative on different sides of the equal sign. But it does have a very different sensation. What he argues then is, by hearkening to his voice, they will be saved from all sickness, since that sickness deservedly comes upon all those who rebel against his will, even as it befell the Egyptians when they did not hearken to him. Okay, so this notion that the illness is deserved is a very powerful one, and one that I also want to take a little pause and wish that we had many more hours to talk about this. Well, at least today. Maybe we'll touch on it in other places as well. With the idea that just because illness can come, or plagues or destruction can come as a result of one's misbehavior, that does not mean that is the only reason that it comes. Sickness may be earned by some, and it may be a natural consequence of the way of the physical world for others. And we, say the rabbis, are not in a position to designate that for other people. We see somebody suffering, we don't say, they must be a sinner. Instead, we say, wow, that's terrible. Let me see if I can help, which we wouldn't do if we believed that they were receiving just punishment. After all, if somebody is complaining about their lack of freedom in prison from having been rightfully convicted of a legitimate crime, we don't try to break them out of prison. We allow them to experience that punishment. But in Judaism, we do not assume that anybody's suffering is deservedly being punished. Instead, we assume that we should help. However, from an internal point of view, if we can use a moment of discomfort to reflect upon ourselves and our lives, that can be a personal choice, but it has to be done constructively rather than destructively. If one becomes obsessed with the idea that all of their misfortune is because of their sins and thus begins to behave in a more irrational way, then that is not healthy either. But maybe you're wondering, like many have, why is this allowed at all? And I'd like to offer an explanation. Now, this is not one that I find as personally very fulfilling, but as hopefully you all know, I like to share multiple voices from within the Jewish tradition. We argue with each other a lot, and it is good to bring competing views, even if they are not your views, just to recognize in good faith that Judaism is a very rich tradition with many different voices. Sefer HaBahir of Rabbi Nehunya Hakana states. So this is a more Kabbalistic work. The verse is aimed at the evil urge, what's known as the Yetzer Hara, also called the evil inclination within us. Seeing that the Israelites' complaints against Moses and God, about which we read just before, were inspired by the evil urge. Okay, so it starts off with this notion that why are we talking about don't rebel? Why are we talking about the plagues of Egypt? Why? Well, we have to go back to our initial statement, which was the people grumbling, that there was a problem already there, that the people were grumbling. They were not asking, they were not checking, they were not wondering, that the people were complaining. And that a complaint at this stage, especially right after the rest of the Exodus had taken place, is very indicative of a Yetzer Hara, of that voice inside of us that often encourages us to behave badly. So, what does that mean? God says that if you will surely hearken to the voice of the Lord your God instead of the voice of the evil urge, and you will observe his commandments instead of the urging of Satan, all his statutes, and not just part of his statutes and part of Satan's urgings, then I will keep away from you all manner of disease, and so on. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit of the figure of Satan, and then we'll continue with this opinion. So Satan in Hebrew and biblical and rabbinic writings is a very different character than in modern Western pop culture. Satan in modern Western pop culture is a rather unusual character of plotting and scheming in some rebellion against God. That is not the Jewish conception. The Jewish conception is that this Satan is an adversary, but it's not, which is literally what the word means, but it's not an adversary of God. It is an adversary of humanity. That is to say, when God is judging us, whether we are good or whether we are bad, the voice of Satan is telling God, they're terrible. Look at what they do. Humanity isn't worth your compassion. Throw the book at them. Now, that's not antagonistic to God. That's antagonistic to us. Imagine you were in court on a speeding ticket and somebody stood up in the back of the room and said, throw the book at him, judge. That person's not attacking the judge. That person is attacking you, the defendant. Now, as such, we have this notion within Judaism that the adversary is not only seeking to list all of our misdeeds to God, but is also seeking to expose the weaknesses within us to God. And that is done so through this vehicle of the Yetzer Hara, that there is this voice inside of us that sometimes encourages us to do wrong just to see whether we'll actually do it. Because if we actually do it, well, then you know what? We deserve the punishment, says Satan, because we shouldn't have given in. It's like the cop who visits a group and offers somebody drugs, and then the person takes it and uses it, and then the cop says, "Aha! See, I knew I could trap you in this." Because all the person had to do was not take the drugs. Now, as we're going to see, we might feel uncomfortable about that notion of trapping a person by providing them with an inspiration or opportunity to commit a crime that they otherwise would have avoided. But within this Kabbalistic framework, such types of activity help to formalize their view of the struggle within each person. So let's use his metaphor, his parable here, and see what he means by that. Let me explain. A king, this is the metaphor. A king had appointed officials in charge of his kingdom and the economic health of his country. Different officials were placed in charge of different departments. One was in charge of the treasury, another in charge of stones for building, a third in charge of exotic foods and fruits. So, standard bureaucracy. It was found that the official in charge of exotic fruit and food enjoyed great popularity. Everyone flocked to him to buy the wares he had to offer. Now, why? Because people like the exotic food and fruit. I mean, who doesn't like tasty things? Whereas most people will avoid doing home improvement projects as long as possible. So it seems only natural. When the official in charge of the building materials saw that he had hardly any customers, he engaged agents to destroy poor people's houses so that they would need to buy stones to repair the damage. All right. This is the point where you're probably feeling a little outraged, and that's okay. This is meant to be a difficult and tense text. So obviously, the person in charge of building material also wants people to be using his department. And if they're not, well, then he will poke and prod and damage their property until they need his department. Now, the metaphor goes on in a little bit more detail. He did not order that the houses which had firm foundations be torn down, as his agents were not able to do that without giving themselves away. It's hard to tear down a well-built house. So not only that, he reasoned that in the time it would take his agents to tear down one solidly built house, they could destroy 20 shacks in the same amount of time. He would then attract 20 customers instead of merely one. By resorting to this stratagem, he hoped to attain the same popularity as a supplier of essential products as had his competitor, the official selling exotic fruit and foods. Okay, before we get to the textual explanation of this and more of the what we call the nimshal, the moral of the story, let's make sure we understand the basic details. So the idea is that there is an agent in charge of building materials who is unhappy that nobody is coming to his shop. Now, what is that probably metaphorically referring to? Well, it is referring to the good things in life, meaning capital G, right in God's eyes, the Torah, the laws, the mitzvot. Those are meant to be the foundation of our life. Those are meant to be the strong points of our life. But unfortunately, a lot of people spend more of their time doing the fun things, hence the exotic foods and fruit, which don't actually provide as much benefit to a life. After all, you can have the best meal you ever had, but if you have to go home and sleep in a leaky shack that's going to be blown over in the next storm, maybe that feast wasn't all that great. And unfortunately, many humans are short-sighted and will focus on the fancy feast rather than on the proper foundation. As such, the agent is not just jealous of the people's focus on the fancy stuff. It is also about, well, they need to repair their homes. They need to build them well. How can that be done? By damaging them. Then they will recognize that there is a problem, and then they will come to him looking to repair it. That seems to be the metaphor for a person in life encountering difficulty, recognizing that many of the foundations of life that they've currently been resting on are not very solid, and turning back to the proper source, meaning Torah, God, and all that entails, in order to properly rebuild into something more durable. And obviously, if you already have a durable, strong foundation, then those other types of damages are not only not going to be easy to be done to you, but they're also not necessary because you don't need that repair. You don't need to improve where you currently are. It's not so much that you are being rewarded or punished as you are being taught according to the need of your education at that time. It would be like driving around and saying, look, there's a hurricane coming and you need to trim these trees and secure that roof and do these other things. And if people were ignoring you, if you got out some rope and some poles and you began pushing over a few trees and poking holes in people's roofs that were already weakened, that might spur them on to do the actual repairs needed. Not because you enjoyed causing the damage, not because you wanted them to suffer the damage, but because if they didn't see the damage, they would never bother doing the repairs. And up to this point, they had incorrectly assumed that they didn't need any improvements. So that's the basic idea that is being brought here. And then let's look at the textual explanation of that. This is the meaning of the verse in Jeremiah 1:14, for evil will originate from the north. In context, this is, of course, talking about the Babylonian war machine, which will come indeed down from the north. This means that Satan has permission to cause destruction only in the northern spheres, which in their Kabbalistic reading means in spheres already prone to destruction, meaning that they are already in weak areas. So somebody that is perfectly strong, meaning that they have a solid foundation of their life, is not susceptible to these pokes and proddings from Satan, because Satan does not have permission to damage something that is in good repair, only to point out what needs additional work. Therefore, in terms of the evil urge, this means that only spiritual weak people are legitimate targets for Satan. The way to fortify oneself against the attempts of Satan to undermine one's well-being is to observe all of God's statutes. By doing this, God will ward off any attempt by Satan to undermine one's piety and faith in him. If Satan were to find a person weakened even a single time, it is as if he opened a door for him to enter. After that, it will be much harder to expel him from an area to which he felt he had been freely admitted. So the underlying concept here at the end is that there is a sneeze. The underlying concept here at the end is that there is this notion of vulnerability. Now, all of us, Sefer HaBahir, as well as Rabbeinu Bachia, who is bringing this as the extended quote, recognize that we all do slip at some point. Indeed, all of us have a Yetzer Hara, have this evil inclination within us. There is nobody without it. And there is many lengthy discussions in the Talmud of it being impossible to be 100% free from it. What then is the text trying to teach us? It's not that if you've opened the door, you're done for, you're doomed to be struggling, but rather if you've opened the door, which means you're human, then yes, you will be struggling, but recognize that the more you strengthen yourself, the more you firm up that foundation, that the easier the struggle will get. That the fulfillment of the mitzvot is actually strengthening your ability to avoid the transgression of the mitzvot. I know that sounds a little obvious, but I don't think it is for many people. That by keeping Shabbat, by keeping your business ethics, by keeping your proper behavior with other people, that you are actually making it harder and harder for that Yetzer Hara to entice you away from doing what is right. That it becomes more and more natural to you, more and more solid in you to continue on a good path. Doesn't mean that you can't still trip, and that is, the danger of arrogance, but it does mean that the fulfillment of the commandments are like bricks in the wall that will help fortify and protect you. They are not just do it or else, but you do it in order to avoid giving in to doing something else that would be worse. All right, let's finish off with Da'at Zikinim, just to talk a little bit more on this theme of preventative Torah. For I, the Lord, am your physician. The word physician means something very different in the ancient world and even the pre-modern world than it does now. The Torah here speaks of preventative medicine, and indeed, for most of our history, that's been the primary form of medicine that actually worked. All of the other types of herbs and things had minor medicinal value, maybe, and sometimes were very not helpful, like bloodletting and such. But preventative medicine could sometimes work. It tells us that God, in his Torah, teaches us how to forestall, how to avoid sickness. Physicians are in the habit of telling their patients what to eat and what not to eat, so that they will not become victims of certain common diseases. And this is true to this day, and it is, of course, something that we continue to ignore when talking to many of our doctors, that preventative medicine is very, very powerful. I believe it was once said by a very wise person, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. This is why the verse commences with the warning to pay heed to what your physician, meaning God, tells you before you become a victim to these diseases. We are to consider the performance of the Torah's commandments as preventative medicine. So this is not about telling you that God will heal you from the problem, although that is always a possibility. But as I mentioned, we are meant to go to the doctor for actual healing. But God is saying, I am your healer, I am your doctor, I am your physician, in that I can tell you how to avoid the problem in the first place. And that is through the performance of the mitzvot. That the commandments were given to us not just so that we would obey God because God has a fixation on obedience, not just so that we would remain a distinct people for God's glory, although certainly that does also happen, but so that we would benefit. That this is the prescription from the ultimate doctor of how to have a better life. And all we have to do is actually fulfill the prescription, do the commandments, do what we should, avoid what we shouldn't, or avoid what we shouldn't do, and we will be able to minimize the problems in our life. As such, this is not a threat, but a prescription. This is not a statement of punishment, but a statement of pleading to try and tell the nation of Israel at those bitter waters, as well as us today, that if you just use Torah, if you just allow yourself to try and follow it, you are going to be in such better circumstances that you won't believe your good fortune. So you may not even need to go to the doctor hardly at all, just by living your life in this better way. Okay, we will stop there for today. I hope that we've had an interesting discussion. I know there's still many more questions that we might ask. And as always, please feel free to contact me to continue the discussion or use the comments of YouTube if that's your preferred means of communication. But these are difficult and deep discussions and ones that are not easily compressed into a small time frame. Take care, everyone, and be well.